Let's deploy the Snowflake Sink Connector for StreamNative Cloud to move some of our data from our topics into Snowflake tables. The first half of this video, we're going to set up Snowflake, create a user, role, database, etc. And then in the second half of this video, we're going to discuss preparing your StreamNative Cloud cluster to create the service account binding and permissions, and then finally deploy the Snowflake Sink Connector, followed by some testing to verify that it's working. So the first thing you need to do when you are creating the account permissions in Snowflake for the account that we're going to use to connect is to create the public and private keys. We'll do that in Terminal. And for Terminal, we'll use OpenSSL, so you have to make sure that's installed. We do OpenSSL gen RSA out SF private key to create the private key in that keys folder I have here on my desktop on the right. And then we're going to use the private key and extract the public key. We do that using OpenSSL RSA in with a reference to the private key, and then pub out, and we create a new file called sfpublickey.pub. And then we'll go ahead and open those public and private keys later. We'll be using the public key when we create the account on Snowflake and the private key when we create the connector in StreamNative Cloud. This is the set of all of the commands I'm going to be executing inside of Snowflake, and I'm going to discuss them one by one very briefly. So first, we're going to create a new database called MySNDatabase. Inside of that database is a schema called MySNSchema. And then we're going to be creating a new role where we supply the permissions. That's going to be SN role, and it will be supplied to the user SN service. So the first thing we need to do once we create that role and service is apply the role to the service. And then we're going to set that as the default role for that service. We need to do that, otherwise in the connector side, we're going to get an error that it can't see this database. So we're going to apply the default role. We're going to give the role usage on the database, the schema, and the warehouse. The warehouse is required so that we can actually see the data once it's in the table. And then we're going to give the role 3 permissions to create tables, stages, and pipes. And all 3 are required. If you don't do stage and pipe, you're also going to get errors on the connector side. And then finally, we need to alter the user, the SN service, to give it its public key that we just created in Terminal using OpenSSL in the previous step. I obviously haven't included the public key here, but you will need to add in your public key that you get out of the file, removing the carriage returns. I don't go ahead and execute this here, but you should execute this, and it will create all of the required database, schema, service, role, and the permissions given here. Let's now set up our StreamNative Cloud cluster so that we can deploy the Snowflake Sink Connector. Before you continue on with the directions in this video, there's 2 tasks you must have completed. The first is you need a service account for running your Snowflake Sink Connector and create a service account binding using SNCutl. I've provided a link in the description to a video that shows exactly how to create that service account and the service account binding. Next, you will have needed to create a tenant and namespace and provide that service account produce, consume, and syncs permissions on the namespace using pulsarctl. I've also provided a link that explains how to do this, but the video provides produce, consume, and function permissions, but you'll need to add produce, consume, and syncs permissions. And likely just consume and syncs would be sufficient, since we may not necessarily be using that service account to publish messages to topics on StreamNative Cloud. We continue this video by first logging into our cluster using pulsarctl, and I'll show you how to get that connection information from the UI now. So here I am in the StreamNative Cloud UI, making sure to have my instance and cluster selected here on the home page. I go down to Pulsar Clients, click on CLI Tools, select pulsarctl, click Next. I've already downloaded and installed pulsarctl, so I'm going to also include a link in the description if you are unfamiliar with how to download it, if it's your first time using it. I then click Next, select my service account that we created, which also has the service account binding, because that's how we want to connect to the cluster. So I will open this drop-down menu and scroll down, and we can find the Sources Syncs Service Account which is the one I created previously that has that binding. I'll download my OAuth 2 token because that's how I'm going to be connecting to the server, and I can move that to a different folder, which I'll then reference that file path in my client configuration, which I'm going to copy and paste from here into terminal. The only part I need to edit is the key file, and I'm going to show you how to edit that to a relative path to the OAuth 2 token that you just downloaded. And here I've pasted in the pulsarctl context set command, and I've edited the key file to have a relative path to my files. I'm in the desktop here in terminal. I have a my files folder on the desktop, and I've placed that OAuth 2 token into that folder. When executing this, making sure to include the pulsarctl OAuth 2 activate section, it should say context training set, or in this case modified. I already had one. And then it should say that you've logged in, and it should be that service account for which the service account binding already exists. Next, let's take a look at the command that we're going to be using to actually create the sink. That's the pulsarctl sinks create command. So before we execute this in terminal, let's go through it step by step. The section above the sink config is going to be pretty similar for any of the connectors that you deploy. I'm going to use for archive a built-in connector that comes from StreamNative Cloud, and that's the Snowflake Connector. It's going to be deployed into the tenant Snowflake tenant and the namespace Snowflake namespace, of which I've already created. The input topic is going to be in that same tenant namespace, so I need to specify those again, and then it's Snowflake input. I'm calling the sink itself Snowflake Sink, and the subscription name for the input topic to the sink is my Snowflake sub. Now, for any of the connectors you're creating, you'll have a special config section that's specific to the config or the sink or source that you are working with. So here in sink config, I have a user. That user is the user account that I created in Snowflake earlier that we executed in the table, or that we executed with the SQL command. The private key we created at the very beginning of the video. So remember, we uploaded the public key into Snowflake, and here's where you put the private key again, making sure to remove the carriage returns. The host here is specific to your deployment of Snowflake, where the first one is the account, and the second part after the hyphen corresponds to the region. Now, the easiest way I've been able to find to get those is to log into Snowflake and open up the lower left corner, and you should see both the host and the region. And I've included a graphic of what that looks like for my Snowflake here in the upper right corner. And then it ends with snowflakecomputing.com. The database and schema we created earlier in the table, or in the SQL commands in Snowflake, and then I also want to turn auto create table to true. I then paste that command into terminal to execute the pulsarctl sinks create command, and you should see that the created Snowflake sink successfully shows up here in terminal. Next, let's go over to StreamNative Cloud UI. Clicking on your instance and cluster, I then go to my Snowflake tenant, Snowflake namespace, click on connectors, and you should see that the Snowflake sink is ready. Going to topics, the Snowflake input topic should also show that the subscription for my Snowflake sub has shown up for that topic. Here I've gone into IntelliJ with some sample code for a producer, and I'm going to produce 10 messages to the Snowflake input topic here. So if I right click and say run, that's going to go ahead and execute and write 10 messages over to that input topic, and we should see the sink connector move them over to Snowflake. So here we are back in StreamNative Cloud UI, and I can see that the connector says that it has sent 10 messages. I can also go over to the topic and verify in the subscription that the backlog is to 0. So here I am logged into Snowflake with the account, with the role account admin, and I can see under data, under databases, my SN database, my SN schema, and then there's the table stages and pipes. And if I open them, you can see that the connector created one of each. And when I click on tables, or the table that got created, I can go to data preview, but it's going to say that I don't have permissions. So even as an account admin, I don't have permissions to view that data. There's a couple things I could do. I could log into the account that has the SN role, because SN role, I did give enough permissions to be able to view the data, or I can provide this account SN role. And that's what I'm going to do right here. I'm going to say grant role SN role to user and then my username. Now that I have that permission, I'm going to switch to that role, which I need to refresh. I'm going to check again, switch to the SN role, then go to data. Select my database and schema. Select the table again, and then go to data preview. And I should be able to see here the 10 messages that I published to my topic from IntelliJ. The connector then moved over to Snowflake, and now I can see them here in this table. There's an alternate approach to viewing this data, and that's to log in as the other user. Before I do that, I'm going to use my account admin privileges. Or before I do that, I need to reset the password. I need to go back to the account admin privileges for this account. Now I can see the user. So for SN service, I'm going to set its password. Now I can log out of this account, log in as the SN service user using the SN role, and I should be able to see the data. So I already got the SN role because that's my default role as we had specified at the very beginning when we created these permissions. Go to data, my SN database, my SN schema, table, click on the table, and in data preview, I'm able to see the data as this user as well.